Real life is often riddled with mind-boggling mysteries that stretches our scientific understanding of the world around us. From mysterious messages that tormented a tiny town to an entire colony disappearing into thin air. In today's video, we will explain 9 famous unsolved mysteries that challenged both human intelligence and humanity. Viewer discretion is advised, as the video will contain facts that may be sensitive to some. 1. The Circleville Letters. Circleville, a little town in Pickaway County in central Ohio, is not the type of place that creates headlines. With an estimated population of 14,085, the town's majority were white American homeowners who were well-educated and had quite the average American life. That is, until 1976, when it all changed. The first letters from the person who would become known as the Circleville writer came out of the blue. These texts were filthy and featured sensitive details about the receivers. Several of the letters included intimate contents. However, by summer 1977, the writer, for some reason, had concentrated his or her hatred on Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver in her mid-30s. The first message to Mary accused her of having an affair, and the writer urged that she end it by confessing out in the open. Mary first tried to keep the story hidden, sharing just the letter to her husband Ron. Although the couple attempted to remain silent, the writer threatened to broadcast it. Ron Gillespie got a call on August 19, 1977. Nobody knows who was on the other end, but Ron was outraged. After hanging up the phone, he grabbed a weapon and drove in his vehicle. Later that day, his wrecked car was discovered wrapped around a tree. Ron was found deceased inside. The mystery surrounding the Circleville writer uncovered buried truths and tore families apart. Paul and Karen Freshour split after Paul discovered that Karen had cheated on him thanks to the letters. The letters also sparked public outrage against Pickaway County Coroner Dr. Ray Carroll. The letters revealed that Dr. Carroll had been accused of groping minors in the past. The Circleville writer case took a terrible turn on February 7, 1983. Mary Gillespie barely escaped a booby-trapped sign equipped with a loaded pistol. The investigation connected the pistol to Paul Freshour, who claimed it was stolen. Despite defective handwriting tests and insufficient evidence, Paul was convicted of attempted murder in 1983 and sentenced to 7 to 25 years in jail. Surprisingly, the letters kept coming even when Paul was in prison. Investigators discovered no evidence connecting Paul to the continuous letters. In one case, the author accused prosecutor Roger Klein of murder while ridiculing Paul's confinement. A year before Paul was released on parole in 1994, a show named Unsolved Mysteries had broadcast on the case in spite of many threat letters. Strangely, the letters stopped once the show aired, and many people became aware of the letters. There are many theories as to who was the writer, with some claiming the writer was David Longberry, another fellow bus driver, or Paul's ex-wife Karen Freshour. Allegations of police misbehavior and ties to Sheriff Radcliffe raised suspicions of a cover-up. The Circleville writer is yet to be identified, making the case a mystery. 2. The outlandish Tunguska Event. The Tunguska Event was a huge explosion of 3 to 50 megatons that occurred on the morning of June 30, 1908, near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River in Russia. The explosion over the area destroyed an estimated 80 million trees across an area of 2,150 square kilometers, or 830 square miles of forest, and eyewitnesses believe up to 3 people were killed. The explosion is commonly ascribed to a meteor airburst, which is the atmospheric explosion of a rocky asteroid roughly 50 to 60 meters or 160 to 200 feet broad. The meteor approached from the east-southeast, most likely at a rather high speed of around 27 kilometers per second or 60,000 miles per hour. Though the occurrence is classified as an impact event, the object is assumed to have burst at a height of 5 to 10 kilometers or 3 to 6 miles rather than reaching the Earth's surface, resulting in no impact crater. This baffled scientists because the explosion was comparable to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, and it was impossible for an explosion of this magnitude from a meteor to not have an impact crater. But this wasn't the only strange detail when it came to this mysterious event. Unlike usual meteorite strikes, no large bits of alien material were discovered at the location, sparking controversy regarding possible causes. In 1930, The British meteorologist and mathematician F.J.W. Whipple proposed that the Tunguska body was a minuscule comet made up of dust and volatiles like water ice and frozen gases, which might have been totally vaporized by its collision with Earth's atmosphere, leaving no visible evidence. However, this explanation was not without flaws. In June 2007, experts at the University of Bologna discovered a lake in the Tunguska area and believed it to be a potential impact crater. They do not deny that the comet body detonated in mid-air, but they believe a 10-meter or 33-foot part survived the explosion and hit the ground. Lake Checo is a tiny bowl-shaped lake located around 8 kilometers or nearly 5.0 miles north-northwest of the hypocenter. However, this theory has also been challenged by other experts on impact craters. The Tunguska Event is the greatest documented impact on Earth, with a shockwave equal to an earthquake measuring 5.0 on the Richter scale. For over 20 years, no scientific investigations to the Tunguska site were conducted, mainly due to its isolated location and detachment thanks to World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the subsequent Civil War. 3. The spontaneous disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was an international passenger airplane operated by Malaysia Airlines that vanished from radar on March 8, 2014. While en route from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia to Beijing Capital International Airport in China. The cause of its disappearance is still unknown to this day. The crew of the Boeing 777-200ER last reached out to Air Traffic Control, or ATC, roughly 38 minutes after takeoff, while the plane was flying over the South China Sea. The aircraft disappeared from ATC's secondary monitoring radar screens minutes later, but the Malaysian military's primary radar system monitored it for another hour, heading westward from the initial flight path and crossing the Malay Peninsula and Andaman Sea. It entered radar range 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometers northwest of Penang Island in northeastern peninsular Malaysia. Prior to the MH370 event in 2014, Malaysia Airlines had successfully flown hundreds of flights between Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. There were no reported indicators or concerns that the airplane was headed toward disaster. According to flight reports, nothing odd occurred on the day of the flight. By all accounts, the airplane was on schedule for Beijing without incident. However, at 2:22 a.m., the aircraft vanished from Malaysian military radar with no distress call, never to be seen again. In the moments following the plane's disappearance, Malaysia planned a search involving more than 24 countries. While initial efforts focused on the South China Sea and the Andaman Sea, attention shifted to the southern Indian Ocean when military radar findings were released on March 12th, and British telecommunications firm Inmarsat shared automated connections between its satellite and the 777, implying that the plane could be somewhere along an arc of coordinates in the southern Indian Ocean. The global search, led by Australia, yielded no results and was called off after 6 weeks. The search, which spanned 120,000 square kilometers, or 46,332 square miles, used ships, submarines, and planes, and cost over $147 million. In 2017, a 440-page study by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, ATSB, revealed that the pilot had flown a route on his home flight simulator 6 weeks before MH370 disappeared that was initially similar to the one flown on March 8th. Aviation investigators looked into the pilot and first officer's backgrounds, training, and mental health and didn't find any alarming or suspicious activity. A different idea suggested a bit more dramatic ending. Months after disappearing, another Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down by a missile over Ukraine during Russia's invasion of Crimea. According to aviation journalist Jeff Wise, 3 Russian passengers were seated near an electrical hatch. This means they might have set up a distraction and then accessed below deck to control the plane. However, this doesn't explain the flight deviation and silent disappearance. Another theory claims that the airplane was brought down by Americans rather than Russians. The U.S. military was carrying out operations in the South China Sea at the time, which led some to believe it downed MH370 after it lost radar contact. According to French journalist Florence de Changy, MH370 had 2.5 tons of electronic equipment on board that had not been inspected before loading and were being carried under escort. On the night MH370 took off, America had 2 radar-blocking jets nearby, which led de Changy to assume they might have wiped the plane off their radar and forced Shaw to land. Once again, this theory never gained any traction. With all 227 passengers and 12 crew members assumed dead, Flight 370's disappearance was the bloodiest aviation event involving a Boeing 777, the deadliest of 2014 and the deadliest in Malaysia Airlines history until it was exceeded in all three categories by Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 taken down by Russia. 4. What's Jack the Ripper's real identity? Jack the Ripper was an anonymous serial murderer who carried out activities around London's poor Whitechapel neighborhood in 1888. Jack the Ripper's attacks generally targeted prostitutes living in London's East End slums. Their necks were severed prior to abdominal mutilation. The removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims raised the possibility that their attacker had some sort of anatomical or surgical knowledge. Mid-19th century was especially a difficult time to be a woman in London. The huge number of attacks on women in the East End during this time raises the question as to the exact number of women who were taken by Jack the Ripper. A Metropolitan Police inquiry involved 11 individual deaths spanning from 3rd April 1888 to 13th February 1891, commonly known as the Whitechapel murders on the police docket. Opinions differ on whether these killings should be attributed to the same perpetrator, but 5 of the 11 Whitechapel cases, known as the Canonical 5, are largely assumed to be the work of the Ripper. Most experts identify the Ripper's modus operandi as deep slash wounds to the throat, followed by considerable stomach and genital area mutilation, organ removal, and gradual face mutilation. The majority of the City of London police papers connected to their investigation into the Whitechapel killings were destroyed during the Blitz. The surviving Metropolitan Police files provide a thorough account of Victorian investigating methods. A big group of officers performed house-to-house searches across Whitechapel. Forensic materials were gathered and analyzed. Suspects were identified, tracked, and either investigated further or excluded from the investigation. In September 1888, a group of voluntary residents in London's East End established the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. They roamed the streets looking for suspicious characters, partially because they were dissatisfied with the police's failure to arrest the perpetrator, and also because some members were worried that these acts were damaging local businesses. Police Surgeon Thomas Bond was adamantly against the claim that the killer had the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer, or even any scientific or anatomical understanding. In his perspective, the perpetrator must have been a man of lonely habits, susceptible to periodic attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, with the character of the mutilations likely indicating satyriasis, or in modern terms, hypersexuality. The frequency of the fatalities around weekends and public holidays, as well as their proximity, have led many to believe that the Ripper worked full-time and lived close. Others believe the killer was an educated, upper-class guy, maybe a doctor or an aristocrat who came to Whitechapel from a more affluent neighborhood. Such beliefs are based on cultural attitudes such as dread of the medical profession, distrust of contemporary science, and unfair treatment of the poor by the wealthy. The word Ripperology refers to the study and investigation of the Ripper case in an attempt to uncover his identity, and its events have inspired several works of fiction. The Ripper killings represent a watershed moment in media coverage of crime. Jack the Ripper was not the first serial killer, but his case was the first that generated an international media response. The nature of the Ripper killings, as well as the victims' wretched lifestyles, attracted attention to the East End's deplorable living circumstances, galvanizing public opinion against the overcrowded, unsanitary slums. The worst of the slums were cleaned and razed 2 decades later, but the streets and some buildings remain, and the Ripper mythology is still propagated through numerous guided tours of the murder sites and other areas related to the case. 5. The Roanoke colony's disappearance. One of America's oldest unresolved mysteries dates back to August 1587, when an expedition of around 115 English immigrants arrived on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Following a disastrous effort at colonization on Roanoke 2 years prior, these colonists aimed to establish the first permanent English presence in the New World. Later that year, it was planned that John White, the new colony's governor, would sail back to England to pick up supplies. However, just as he landed, a huge naval conflict erupted between England and Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I dispatched every available ship to meet the formidable Spanish Armada. White ultimately returned to Roanoke in August 1590, 3 years after leaving his wife and daughter, as well as his baby granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, and the other immigrants. He discovered no sign of the colony or its people, and just one word, Croatoan, carved onto a wooden post. Investigations regarding the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke have lasted centuries, but no one has found a convincing solution. The name Croatoan referred to an island south of Roanoke that was home to the same-named Native American tribe. Perhaps the Native Americans slaughtered or abducted the colonists. Other theories say that they attempted to sail back to England on their own and became lost at sea, died at the hands of Spaniards who had marched up from Florida, or migrated deeper interior and were assimilated into a friendly tribe. In 2007, attempts began to gather and test DNA from local families to determine if they were linked to the Roanoke immigrants, local Native American tribes, or both. Despite the persisting mystery, it appears that there is one thing to be grateful for. The lessons acquired at Roanoke may have aided the next group of English immigrants who established their own colony 17 years later, just a little distance to the north at Jamestown. 6. Where are the Sodder children? In Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder home was destroyed by fire on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1945. At the time, it was home to George Sodder, his wife Jenny, and 9 of their 10 children. During the fire, George, Jenny, and 4 of the 9 children fled. The corpses of the remaining 5 children have never been found. Fayetteville, West Virginia was a tiny coal mining community set in the Appalachian Mountains. The tight-knit town was popular among Italian immigrants looking for work in the state's thriving coal sector. Jenny Cipriani was a shopkeeper's daughter who moved to America with her parents from Italy, whereas George Sodder was an outspoken Sardinian-Italian immigrant. The couple fell in love and married half a world away from their childhood homes, settling into a 5-bedroom, 2-story house just outside town. They had 10 children before George established his own profitable coal trucking business. Despite the shadow of a world war, the young family appeared delighted to live out the great American dream in their suburban utopia. That is, until Christmas Day, 1945. Police searched the ruins early on Christmas morning and found a few bones and internal organs. However, the bereaved parents were informed that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were not found. The fire chief felt the blaze had been intense enough to totally cremate the bodies. George and Jenny were stunned, but they originally accepted the official's word that the 5 children had likely died in the fire. On December 30th, the family received 5 certificates for each of their children, with the cause of death indicated as fire or suffocation. George and Jenny were told to stay away from the location while another search was conducted. However, less than a week later, the family patriarch cleared the wreckage with a bulldozer and buried what remained of the house under 5 feet of soil. The property would become a memorial to the children, and the remainder of the Sodders would relocate to a house on the opposite side of the pine tree that overlooked their former home. An investigation determined that the fire was caused by improper wiring in George's study. But George began to have doubts, recalling that a local power company had recently inspected the wiring. There was also the inexplicable absence of the ladder, which was normally leaned against the Sodders' house but could not be found on the night of the fire. It was then found dumped 22 meters down an embankment from the home. As part of their inquiry, investigators learned that the house's telephone line had been severed the night before the fire. Neighbors reported seeing a shady guy near the Sodder residence on Christmas Eve remove a block and chain from George's garage. The individual was eventually located and recognized as a local, Lonnie Johnson. He pled guilty to stealing and disconnecting the phone connection, but denied any role in the fire. They also came to assume that their 5 children were not killed on Christmas Day, but rather abducted, and the fire was set to cover it up. 2 years after the catastrophe at their home, the Sodders commissioned a study from an Ohio crematorium that disputed official claims that the fire was hot enough to cremate the bodies. On the other hand, a woman working at a Charleston hotel claimed to have seen the children at work on Christmas Day, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. Another woman who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, some 80 kilometers west, claimed she fed the children breakfast the morning following the fire. As rumors circulated, the Sodders contacted C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator, to look into any leads on their missing children's location. He noticed further abnormalities in the case, as well as a potential clue. Months before the fire broke out at the house, he discovered George had been intimidated by a local salesperson who attempted to sell them life insurance. After refusing an offer to insure his children, the individual reportedly threatened the Sodders that their house would go up in smoke and their children would be destroyed because of George's statements about Italy's fascist leader, Benito Mussolini. According to police investigations quoted by the West Virginia Times, George maintained 55-gallon barrels of gasoline in his basement for use in his coal transportation company. Cruikshank, the firefighter interviewed by the newspaper, believes this would have increased the temperature of the fire. When the Sodders covered the embers with earth less than a week after the fire, he claims they unintentionally built an oven that accelerated the cremation process. This may explain why the children's remains were never discovered. The Sodder siblings who survived grew up without missing siblings, and their parents bore the burden of their unsolved disappearance until their deaths. The Sodders also advocated for missing children and fire safety until the very end. 7. Do the Pollock sisters prove reincarnation? It was May 1957, in the little village of Hexham near Newcastle upon Tyne, England. Joanna Pollock, age 11, and her younger sister Jacqueline, age 6, were hit by an unpredictable driver when they were traveling to church with their friend Anthony. Almost immediately, the two girls passed away on the spot. Anthony, 9 years old, died on the way to the hospital. It was then determined that the driver, a local lady under the influence of many narcotics, had purposefully struck the three children after being forcibly taken from her own children. The episode later made headlines across Britain, and the woman was finally sent to a psychiatric facility. Joanna and Jacqueline's parents, John and Florence Pollock, were heartbroken by their daughter's demise. However, when Florence got pregnant, John felt certain that the two girls would be reincarnated into the family as twins. The couple, who were committed Catholics, frequently disagreed over the concept of reincarnation, with Florence passionately opposing John's ideas. There had also been no history of twins in either parent's family. Florence's doctor had expected a single delivery after hearing only one heartbeat throughout the pregnancy, indicating a minimal possibility of twins. Despite all chances, Florence gave birth to twin daughters on October 4, 1958. The twins' names were Jillian and Jennifer. Strangely, Jennifer had a little birthmark on her left hip that looked much like Jacqueline's. She also had a birthmark on her forehead, which looked identical to Jacqueline's little scar in the same area. However, when the girls grew older, it became evident that Jillian and Jennifer remembered Hexham vividly, despite not having grown up in the little town. Similarly, the twins identified their late sister's toys by name. Although Florence had kept the late girl's toys out of sight, the twins began to request specific items. In fact, the twins seemed to recall the toys as their own. They were able to name their toys using the names that had previously been given to them, and they even divided the toys precisely like their sisters did. Florence and John also noted that the twins' personalities were extremely similar to their elder sisters. Just like Joanna was protective of her younger sister Jacqueline, Jillian appeared more mature than her twin sister. Florence continued to reject the concept of reincarnation during the twins' early years. She reconsidered her decision after discovering the twins discussing the accident. Florence overheard the girls playing a game in which they replicated their sister's accident. Jillian was caressing Jennifer's head and telling her, "There's blood pouring out of your eyes. That's where the car hit you." On another occasion, Jillian pointed to Jennifer's forehead birthmark and said, "This is the mark Jennifer got when she fell on a bucket." Interestingly, the twin girls also looked to be afraid of cars. In their early years, the twins had reoccurring dreams about being struck by a car. Shortly after turning 5, the twins' recollections of their previous lives faded as they resumed their usual lives. While the twins' memories of the event were completely erased, Jillian subsequently recalled seeing herself playing in a sand pit at a Wickham property. The property that Jillian described so accurately, including the house and yard, was identical to the one Joanna lived in with her parents when she was 4. The story drew a lot of scholarly attention, particularly from Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist and researcher at the University of Virginia School of Medicine who is interested in reincarnation. Dr. Stevenson interviewed the twins and their parents in 1964 for his book, Children Who Remember Previous Lives. In his writing, he admitted that the twins exhibited several behaviors that were difficult to explain. Despite this, The Pollock twins' case is still hotly debated. While it has long been presented as proof of reincarnation, many people believe the twins' recollections were impacted by their 4 elder brothers. Others have speculated that the narrative was made up and that the parents tried to gain fame and money from the reincarnation claim. 8. Indecipherable Voich manuscript. The Voich manuscript is an illustrated book handwritten in an unknown script known as Voinicese. The vellum on which it is written has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, probably between 1404 and 1438. According to stylistic research, the text was most likely written in Italy during the Italian Renaissance. The manuscript's origins, authorship, and purpose are still discussed, but academics currently lack the translations and context required to consider or rule out any of the options. The Voich manuscript appears to include 7 distinct divisions. Voynich devotees have given each part a conventional term throughout time, such as botanical, astrological, cosmological, zodiac, biological, medicinal, and recipes. With images of a lot of clothless women, many believed the manuscript to be a book for the women of the ancient society. The first verified owner was George Berish, a 17th century scientist from Prague. The manuscript is named for Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book merchant who bought it in 1912. The manuscript has around 240 pages. However, there is evidence that some pages are missing. The text is written from left to right, and certain pages are foldable sheets with different widths, adding more mystery to the manuscript. The Voynich manuscript has been analyzed by both professional and amateur cryptographers, including American and British codebreakers during World Wars I and II. The codebreakers Prescott Currier, William Friedman, Elizabeth Friedman, and John Tiltman were unsuccessful. Much of the book's early origins are unclear, although the language and images are all distinctively European. In 1921, William Romaine Newbold of the University of Pennsylvania conducted one of the first attempts to decipher the book's encryption. His unique idea argued that the visible text is meaningless, and that each apparent letter is actually made up of a succession of small marks seen only under magnification. These symbols were meant to be based on ancient Greek shorthand, creating a second level of script that included the actual substance of the text. Newbold's approach was later disregarded as highly speculative after John Matthews Manley of the University of Chicago pointed out major faults in his idea. Gibbs, a historical researcher and television writer, claims that the apparent code in the Voynich manuscript is actually a collection of Latin abbreviations, with each character representing an abbreviated phrase rather than a letter. He argues that once the characters are deciphered, the manuscript will become obvious. Of course, many experts hypothesized that the entire thing was forged by Voynich, but this is highly unlikely. This book required a significant amount of effort to construct, particularly the seeming consistency of the language. Gibbs didn't want to decode the manuscript, rather, he wanted to track its ownership further back in time, closer to its origin. When traced back, it is believed to have belonged to Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in the early 17th century. He was captivated by the odd and exceptional and was a rational collector of it. A new ownership was traced back to a letter made by 17th century physician Johannes Marci von Kronlund to Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, who stated that Rudolf acquired it for 600 ducats. Kircher was unable to translate it, and the text slipped into Jesuit collections, never to be seen again until Voynich discovered it. Even in the 21st century, the Voynich writing is still being studied for clues to its meaning and origin. 9. Bone-chilling Dyatlov Pass Incident. Another tragic yet mysterious event was the Dyatlov Pass tragedy, in which 9 Soviet hikers disappeared under bizarre circumstances in the northern Ural Mountains on February 1st and 2nd, 1959. The experienced trekking party from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, commanded by Igor Dyatlov, had set up camp on the eastern slopes of Kholat-Syakhl in the Russian SFSR of the Soviet Union. Overnight, something led them to cut their way out of their tent and abandon the encampment, despite being insufficiently clothed for the heavy snowstorm and sub-zero conditions. Following the discovery of the group's remains, Soviet officials conducted an investigation and decided that 6 of them died of hypothermia, while the remaining 3 died of physical violence. 1 victim sustained significant skull injury, 2 suffered serious chest injuries, and a 3rd had a minor rupture in his head. 4 victims were discovered in flowing water in a stream a distance from the encampment location, with 3 of them having injured soft tissue of the head and face, 2 with missing eyes, 1 with a missing tongue, and 1 with missing brows. The study determined that the fatalities were caused by a compelling natural force. Several explanations have been proposed to explain the inexplicable fatalities, including animal assaults, hypothermia, an avalanche, katabatic winds, infrasound-induced fear, military participation, or a mix of these reasons. Russia launched a fresh inquiry into the tragedy in 2019, and its findings were released in July 2020. An avalanche had caused the deaths. Survivors of the avalanche were forced to leave their camp unexpectedly in low-visibility circumstances with minimal gear, and several died from cold. However, many disagreed with this explanation. Turns out, there were no apparent signs that an avalanche had occurred at the scene of the tragedy. Debris and specific patterns would have been scattered across a large region following an avalanche. The remains, recovered within a month after the incident, were covered under a thin coating of snow. Even though the strange circumstances of the young hikers remain unsolved, several films have been produced in an effort to uncover a potential explanation. Despite breakthroughs in science, technology, and human creativity, there are certain cases that remain unsolved, feeding the pursuit for truth. Which of the above cases caught your attention the most? Let us know in the comments section below.